Here's a question I like to ask people. Paramedic students generally don't get this, but interestingly, a lot of working paramedics don't get it either. And the question is this: why do we give patients oxygen? What does it do? Other than it's good for them, what are the actual physiological effects that we're trying to achieve by administering oxygen to someone? And it's surprising the answers you get. Usually, most people get stuck at the level of, well, cells don't work properly without it. Without oxygen, cells die. That's kind of as far as we get. Some horrifically say, well, that's what my clinical practice guidelines say, so I just do it. Hopefully, in a university education, that's not the sort of answer you're going to give as a paramedic. So let's talk about oxygen and what oxygen actually does. And I'm going to break it down really, really simple. I'm not going to draw out the Krebs cycle or anything like that, although I will mention it. But I'm going to talk about what we consider to be cellular respiration, and I'm going to talk about acid production. And those are the two main reasons that we give oxygen. So let's talk about the first one, which is cellular respiration. Just to clarify some terms, we have ventilation, we have respiration. Ventilation is the movement of gases through the movement of our body. Respiration is the exchange of gases. So we have external respiration, which is exchanging the gas that's inside our lungs with the gas that's in the environment. And we have internal respiration, which is exchanging the gases that are in our blood with the gases inside of our cells. We also have something called cellular respiration, which is a bit more complicated and not related to what we normally think of as breathing, although as with everything in the body, it's interconnected. So why do we give oxygen? Well, first of all, let's talk about energy production, because we need oxygen in order to efficiently make energy. Let's say you've got your big cell here, and you want to get some energy going. You want to be able to produce some energy so that you can live, you can move, you can talk, you can make videos for YouTube or whatever. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to take some sugar. We get sugar as sort of the stored energy potential in our body. Whenever we eat food, a lot of that food is converted and broken down into sugar. And sugar is C6H12O6. That's glucose, and that's the sort of sugar that our liver produces. And that circulates around inside of our body and acts as the substrate for energy. So our brains need glucose in order to run. They can't use any other fuel. If you interrupt the glucose flow or if you interrupt the oxygen flow, you'll see why, then we pass out because the brains won't work properly. So we take this glucose, and the first thing we do inside the cell is something called glycolysis. So we take up our, not glucolysis, glycolysis. We take this glucose and we lyse it, from the Greek to separate, I think. So we lyse the glucose and we break it down into some of its constituent parts. That happens inside the cytoplasm in the cell. So the sugar, the food comes into our body, we digest it out of our digestive system, it goes into our bloodstream through the hepatic vein into the liver. Liver takes all of that, breaks it down, produces sugar, pushes sugar out into the bloodstream. The sugar comes along the bloodstream, goes into the cytoplasm of the cell, and inside the cytoplasm, glycolysis takes place, and we break down the cell. We break down the glucose, not the cell. So we break down the sugar, and no real energy comes from that. We actually do get a little bit coming out, but that's not really enough to keep us alive. The next step that happens is that broken bit of sugar comes down into what's called the Krebs cycle, Krebs, named after Hans Krebs, who discovered it in 1937. Eventually got a Nobel Prize in medicine for the discovery of the Krebs cycle. It's also called the citric acid cycle, and there's some other names for it, but this is the Krebs cycle. In the Krebs cycle, we need oxygen. This happens in the mitochondria, by the way. So we've gone from the cytoplasm of the cell into the mitochondria. Glycolysis, which incidentally does not require oxygen to work, leads into this Krebs cycle in the mitochondria, which does require oxygen to work. And in the Krebs cycle, the sugar's broken down a little bit more. A whole bunch of complex chemical things happen, which quite honestly is a clinical paramedic, who cares? You know, maybe in a test somewhere you might want to learn that, but you don't need to memorize the Krebs cycle in order to be a good clinician. You need to understand what it does. That's what I'm talking about. So in the Krebs cycle, a few things happen. We get a little bit of energy produced, but the biggest thing that we get coming out of the Krebs cycle is carbon dioxide. And that carbon dioxide is what we exhale. So we breathe it out into the atmosphere, breathe in some more oxygen. From the Krebs cycle, these products go down to something called the electron transport chain. And that's, as it implies, a movement of a whole bunch of electrons, which again goes through a whole bunch of complicated stuff that you don't need really to memorize. But what comes out of the electron transport chain is the recharging of something called adenosine triphosphate, which you should know about. And this is how I think of adenosine. Adenosine is like our ATP. It's like a battery inside of our body. We've got millions, billions, trillions, I don't know how many, of these little adenosine molecules. And as adenosine travels around, imagine you've got adenosine, and there's three little connectors on the adenosine which we can attach phosphates to. And it takes energy to put these phosphates on. So I go, when I put on a phosphate, 2 phosphates, put on another one, I got 3. So this would be adenosine triphosphate, fully charged, adenosine diphosphate, got to use the right fingers here, and adenosine monophosphate, and that's just adenosine. So this is a completely empty battery, low charge, medium charge, fully charged. So that's what we have floating around our body. We use energy to put these on, energy coming out of the cellular respiration here, glycolysis, Krebs, and electron transport chain. And that's how we recharge our adenosine. And then the adenosines float around in the body, and when a muscle wants to contract, for example, it grabs an adenosine and it rips off a phosphate, which goes poof, and we get a big bit of energy. And now I've gone down to adenosine diphosphate, which goes away, eventually coming back here to be recharged. And my muscle or organelles in the cell wall or things all throughout the body now have energy from these adenosine triphosphate batteries. So our bodies run on ATP batteries, and the way they're recyclable batteries, and the way we recycle them is through this cellular respiration. We take a little bit of oxygen in, we take a little bit of sugar in, and we go through glycolysis, Krebs, and the electron transport chain, and that ends up producing ATP. So if we take our glucose molecule up here and we add a little bit of oxygen to it, specifically we add 6 oxygens to it, then what we end up getting coming out of here are a little bit of water, which I haven't mentioned, but water is a byproduct of this. So I actually get 6 waters coming out. We also get 6 carbon dioxides coming out, and in an ideal world, in an ideal sort of equation, we get roughly about 36 to 38, let's just say 38, new adenosine triphosphate recyclable batteries recharged. It all kind of depends, and we're still don't entirely know how this works, but this is the rough idea. So some books will say 38 ATP, some will say 36. It actually really depends on how much oxygen you have in the process. So the more oxygen you have, the more efficient this process is. If you don't have any oxygen at all, you actually do end up still producing ATP, but you only produce 2. So really, if you want to be really accurate, you could say that through this process of cellular respiration, depending on how much oxygen you have, you're going to get anywhere from about 2 to 38 ATP coming out of there. And the more oxygen you have, the more efficient you'll be in recharging your batteries. So if it's fully oxygenated process, about 38. If it's a completely deoxygenated process, about 2. And so why do we give people oxygen? We give people oxygen so that they can recharge the adenosine triphosphate through the process of cellular respiration so that they have energy for metabolism, energy for living. There's another reason that we give oxygen to patients. The second reason, let me get another colored marker for this. I'll use blue. Throughout our body, we like to use sugar. Sugar is a great carbohydrate to use. It's very efficient, the glucose. But we can use, in addition to, well, let me say carbohydrates. In addition to carbohydrates, I'll just call those CHO, we can also, in various cells, not in the brain, but in cells like in the heart, instead of burning glucose or carbohydrates, we can also burn fats and we can also burn proteins. The problem is this isn't a very efficient burning, so you get kind of an incomplete combustion of these. And one of the byproducts of that incomplete combustion are some acids. Acids, as we know, all have to do with hydrogen. We've got a hydrogen ion. And there's a ton of acids that can be produced. Lactic acid is probably the most familiar one because that's produced in our muscles. But there's a ton of acids that can be produced, and the common factor in all of them is that they've got this hydrogen ion. So why is that important? Well, because if there's a hydrogen ion, it's got a positive charge, which means it's looking to get a full charge. It's got not enough, it's unbalanced in the way of being positive. So if it could gain a negative, it would go back to neutral and it would be happy. How do you gain a negative floating around in a big bowl of human meat? You grab electrons. So you go up to some tissue and go, I want your electron, and you rip it off. And that actually destroys tissue. So it's very destructive. If you pour acid on your hand, it burns it. And the way it burns it is by pulling electrons off of your tissue. So we don't want that. We've got this really dangerous hydrogen floating around in our body that we need to get rid of somehow. How do you do this? You might think you need a very esoteric buffer type of chemical, that you have to inject into your skin or something. But obviously we don't, because we go around producing hydrogen all the time and we always survive. How do we get rid of it? Well, we've got a really elegant system. For every 2 acids that we have floating around, we connect them with 1 oxygen. And that produces H2O, water. So by breathing in the oxygen, we combine it with this highly dangerous, deadly hydrogen, and we turn it into water and just pee it out. And we've got rid of all this dangerous acid that's inside of our body. So cellular respiration is one reason why we give our patients oxygen. And the neutralization of metabolic fixed acids is the other reason why we give patients oxygen. Nice and easy, nice and simple. You don't have to remember a whole bunch of formulas or anything like that. It's just a really simple explanation. So we do it for ATP, and we give oxygen because of hydrogen. If you can remember that, you can have a really great answer to the question of, why do we give our patients oxygen?